strange how family can be the ones who hurt you the most. They're supposed to be your foundation, your support system. But for me, growing up, that wasn't the case. From the moment I could remember, I was always the odd one out. Not because I was rebellious, but because I didn't have the same things they did. While my cousins drove new cars, had the latest gadgets, and went on lavish vacations, I was struggling to pay rent. I worked multiple jobs, but no matter how hard I tried, it felt like I could never catch up. My family didn't understand that. To them, money was everything, and I didn't have enough of it. When the invitation for the annual family reunion came around, I wasn't expecting much. But when it didn't arrive, I couldn't help but notice. I didn't even get a text. The rest of the family was going, but for some reason, I had been excluded. The reason? They didn't say it out loud, but it was clear I was too poor to fit in. I didn't let it bother me. At least that's what I told myself. But deep down, it hurt more than I cared to admit. I had worked so hard my entire life, but none of it seemed to matter to them. I wasn't the rich, successful person they expected me to be. So I spent that weekend on my own, reflecting on everything. I thought about how they never invited me to any of the big events, never checked in to see how I was doing, and how they always seemed to treat me like I was inferior. But then, something inside me clicked. I didn't need their approval. I had spent too long trying to meet their expectations. Maybe it was time I started meeting my own. After that year's reunion, I thought it would be the last time I'd ever care about my family's approval. But as the months passed, it wasn't just the reunion that stung. It was the ongoing silence. Every holiday, every birthday, I noticed I was always left out. My cousins would post pictures of their fancy dinners and trips on social media, tagging each other and celebrating milestones together. I was never included, not even a simple text or a "Hey, how are you?" It wasn't that I wanted their attention or validation. It was the feeling of being invisible. My siblings weren't excluded. They had their own struggles, sure, but they were always welcomed. They were part of the circle. And me? I wasn't. The worst part wasn't the lack of invites or the coldness I felt from them. It was the unspoken judgment in their eyes when I was around. It wasn't just the money, they looked at me like I didn't belong in their world. I could feel the discomfort whenever I walked into a room. My clothes weren't the latest brands. My car was old. And most of the time, I felt like I had to explain myself for being different. It wasn't that they outright said anything hurtful, but their actions spoke louder than words. I began to doubt myself. Was I truly not good enough? Why did I have to live this life of struggle while they had everything handed to them? But deep down, I knew I didn't need to explain myself to anyone. I had worked hard for what little I had, and I was proud of it. But that didn't stop the loneliness. I used to wonder why I wasn't accepted for who I was, for the person I had become. Why couldn't they see me as someone worth respecting? It hurt, but it also fueled a fire inside me. Maybe it was time to stop seeking their approval. Maybe it was time for me to build something that didn't rely on their acceptance. I took a deep breath and promised myself something that day. I wouldn't spend another minute trying to fit into a world that didn't accept me. Something inside me shifted after that. I had spent years feeling bitter, questioning my worth, and trying to make sense of why my family couldn't see beyond my financial situation. But I realized I couldn't keep waiting for them to change or accept me. If I wanted something different, I had to create it for myself. That's when I made a decision that would change the course of my life. I would stop living in the shadows of their wealth and start building my own. I didn't have connections, I didn't have a trust fund, and I didn't have the luxury of starting with a leg up. But I did have determination. And that's something you can't buy. I dove into self-education. Every free moment I had, I consumed books, podcasts, and articles about entrepreneurship, investing, real estate, and personal growth. It was overwhelming at first. I didn't know where to start. But the more I learned, the clearer it became. I needed to build my own financial foundation. No one was going to do it for me, and I couldn't afford to keep depending on others to fix my problems. I started small, way smaller than I'd ever imagined. I bought a fixer-upper property, a tiny little house that most people wouldn't have even considered. But I saw its potential. I worked weekends and late nights, flipping it myself with the little money I had saved up. I learned the ins and outs of real estate, and after months of hard work, I sold it for a profit. It wasn't a fortune, but it was a step forward. And then I did it again. And again. Each time I learned more. Each time I made a bit more money. It wasn't glamorous, but it was real. And for the first time in my life, I felt like I was in control. Slowly but surely, I built something that wasn't dependent on anyone's approval. My financial situation started to improve, and with that, my confidence grew. I was no longer the poor relative trying to fit in. I was becoming someone who could stand on my own. As my success started to grow, so did my peace of mind. I stopped caring about being part of their world. I didn't need them to see me as successful. I already knew I was. But something inside me still longed for the validation I never got. I had to remind myself, this journey was mine, not theirs. Years passed, and my life began to look very different from the one I had known. I was no longer the person who had to beg for invitations to family events or try to explain why I couldn't afford the things that they took for granted. I had created a life that was entirely my own. Confidence I had once lacked was now my greatest asset. I'd built a small portfolio of real estate and had even started my own consulting business. Things were finally looking up. But there was something about those family gatherings that always seemed to linger in my mind, even as I moved forward. Despite all the success, despite all the growth, I still couldn't shake the feeling of being abandoned. Then one day the phone rang. It was an unknown number, but something told me it might be important. When I answered, I could immediately tell that it was my cousin, Rachel, on the other end. "Hey, it's been a while," she said, sounding almost awkward. "I hope you're doing well." I was surprised. The last time I had heard from her was, well, never. "Hi, Rachel." "What's up?" I asked, trying to keep the conversation light. She hesitated, almost as if trying to find the right words. "Look, I know things were kind of tense last time, but we're having a big family reunion next month and we'd really like you to come." My heart skipped a beat. It had been years since I'd been invited, and I didn't expect them to ever reach out to me again. I stayed silent for a moment, thinking about it. The invitation was nice, sure, but what did it really mean? Were they asking me because they finally saw my worth? Or was it just because they felt obligated now that I was successful? "I'm not sure," I said, keeping my voice steady. "I've been doing well, Rachel. And I've moved on from all of that." Her tone shifted. "Look, I'm not saying this to make you feel bad, but we've all been talking. Some of us realize now that we were wrong. We made assumptions about you. I think it's time we made things right." I couldn't help but feel a little surprised by her words. But there was still a part of me that was hesitant. Had they really changed, or was this just an attempt to fill the void in their own lives? Till I agreed. I wasn't going to let the past control me. "I'll come," I said finally. "But only if it's real. No more pretending." The day of the reunion arrived, and I found myself standing in front of the familiar house that used to feel like a prison. The lawn was perfectly manicured, the house pristine, just like every other family gathering they'd hosted over the years. The difference this time was that I wasn't the same person I had been when I'd last walked through that door. As I stepped out of my car, I could feel the weight of years of rejection lifting off my shoulders. The house, the people, the expectations, they no longer held the power they once did. I wasn't the poor cousin who needed to prove herself. I was a different person now, stronger, more confident, and most importantly, independent. When I entered the house, the chatter stopped. All eyes were on me. I could feel the tension in the air. For a moment, I stood there, taking it all in. My cousins, my aunts and uncles, people who had never given me a second thought, were staring as if I were a stranger. It was clear they didn't know how to react to me now. I had been absent from their lives for so long, and I could see it in their eyes. They hadn't expected me to succeed. And they certainly didn't expect me to walk in like this, exuding a kind of quiet confidence that they had never seen from me before. I took a deep breath and made my way over to the buffet table where my Aunt Karen was serving food. She was the one who had always been the loudest when it came to pointing out my failings. "Look who finally showed up," she said with a half smile, her tone dripping with something I couldn't quite place, surprise, maybe, or maybe guilt. I smiled back, holding my ground. "Yeah, I thought I'd finally make an appearance. It's been a while, hasn't it?" Her eyes narrowed, as if trying to assess if I was joking or serious. But before she could respond, Rachel, my cousin, walked up and gave me a big hug. "I'm so glad you came," she said, genuinely smiling. "It's been way too long." Her warmth was a stark contrast to the cold reception I had gotten just moments earlier. I realized then that not everyone was responsible for the way things had played out. There were people who had cared, people who had been hurt just as much by the distance as I had been. But there were also those who, like Karen, were too proud to admit their mistakes. As the night went on, I noticed the uncomfortable glances between my family members. They tried to make small talk, but it was clear that they were unsure of how to interact with me now. My transformation had thrown them off balance. I could tell they were trying to wrap their heads around the fact that the person they had once looked down on had outgrown the small world they'd kept me in. I wasn't the same. I wasn't too poor anymore, and I wasn't interested in being part of the same cycle of judgment and superficiality that had defined this family for so long. The evening wore on, and I couldn't help but notice how my family was looking at me differently. It wasn't with pity or judgment anymore. Now there was curiosity in their eyes. A little admiration even. But I wasn't there for their admiration. I was there for me. To prove to myself that I didn't need them. That I was okay on my own. As the night ended and people began to trickle out, Karen approached me one last time. She seemed to have softened, but I could tell there was still some pride left in her. "You've done well for yourself," she said, her voice almost apologetic. "Maybe we misjudged you." I nodded, accepting the compliment without bitterness. Maybe. But that's in the past now. As the days passed after the reunion, something inside me shifted. I had gone there expecting some sort of grand revelation, perhaps that my family would finally apologize for their past treatment of me. But the more I thought about it, the clearer it became. I didn't need them to apologize. It was a hard pill to swallow at first, but I realized that the reunion wasn't about me seeking validation or acceptance. It was about showing them the person I had become, not the person they had rejected years ago. I had proved to myself that I was capable of creating a life I could be proud of, and that was all that truly mattered. However, things didn't stop with that one night. Over the following weeks, my family members began reaching out in small, unexpected ways. Some sent texts, others called, and a few even invited me to gatherings that weren't about the grand reunion but felt more personal. It was as if they were slowly trying to make up for the years of exclusion and judgment. But here's the thing, I wasn't interested in fixing the past. The more they tried, the more I realized I had outgrown the need to prove anything to them. I had already forgiven them, not because they asked for forgiveness, but because I understood that they had their own flaws, insecurities, and biases. I was no longer the person they used to define me as. One evening, my mom called me, sounding a little more serious than usual. "Can we talk?" she asked. "I've been thinking a lot about what happened at the reunion, and I think I owe you an apology." I paused for a moment, surprised. My mom had always been the type to brush things off, never one to dwell on conflict. But hearing her voice crack slightly made me realize that she had been carrying her own guilt about what had happened. "You don't have to apologize, Mom," I said gently. "I've moved on from it." She sighed, almost as if a weight had been lifted. "I know you have, but I think it's important for me to say it anyway. You're right. We should have never treated you like that. And I'm proud of what you've done for yourself." Her words felt like a balm to the wound I hadn't even realized was still there. I wasn't looking for her approval, but hearing her speak those words was a reminder that sometimes healing starts with acknowledging the pain, even when it's too late. That conversation marked a turning point in my relationship with my family. Not that I was suddenly going to rely on them or allow their opinions to dictate my future, but I could finally see them for who they were, not perfect, not always right, but human. And it wasn't just my mom who had changed. Slowly, each family member started to recognize how much I had accomplished and how much I had transformed. They began to see me not as the person they had rejected all those years ago, but as someone who had created a new legacy, one they could no longer ignore. As time went on, I realized that my family's perception of me had changed, but I had also begun to see them through a different lens. I had spent so many years wishing for their approval, feeling like I needed to prove myself. But now I understood something that had been so clear all along. I didn't need them to validate my worth. They might not have been there when I needed them the most, but I had learned to stand on my own. And in some ways, that was the greatest gift I could have given myself. My success wasn't just about money or accomplishments. It was about personal growth, resilience, and the understanding that family wasn't always about blood. It was about the bonds you chose to nurture. I continued to build my business, expanding into new ventures that aligned with my passions. But something unexpected happened along the way. As I started to succeed, I became more interested in creating a legacy that was different from the one my family had tried to define for me. I wanted to leave behind more than just wealth. I wanted to leave behind a message. A message about overcoming obstacles, about the importance of being true to oneself, and about never letting anyone define your future. That's when I decided to invest in a project that would become my most significant legacy yet. I used a portion of my wealth to fund a community center in the town where I had grown up. The center would offer educational resources, mentorship programs, and a safe space for young people to learn, grow, and chase their dreams, no matter their background or financial status. I could have easily used that money to buy another property or fund an extravagant vacation. But I realized that the wealth I had accumulated wasn't just for me. It was for something bigger. And in a way, it was my way of giving back to the community that had once looked down on me, but now I had the power to change lives. When I first opened the community center, I didn't expect much from my family. But when the grand opening day arrived, there they were, my cousins, my aunts, and even Karen, who had been the harshest critic of all. They were all standing in front of the building, looking at it with a mixture of awe and disbelief. They were witnessing firsthand the legacy I had created, and they couldn't deny its significance. Karen walked up to me with a soft smile, her eyes glistening slightly. I didn't think you had it in you, she admitted, her voice full of sincerity. But I was wrong. You've done something amazing. I didn't need her approval anymore, but it felt good to hear her words. She wasn't the only one who had changed. I had too. I had learned to let go of the past and focus on the future, on the lives I could touch, the dreams I could help build. As the day ended, I stood there, looking at the community center with a sense of pride. It wasn't just about me anymore. It was about the countless people who would walk through those doors and find a new sense of hope, just as I had once found mine. The family that had once abandoned me was now witnessing the legacy I had built, not through wealth or material possessions, but through giving back and helping others create their own futures. They walked into my legacy, and it wasn't about me proving anything to them. It was about me being the person I had always known I could be. Community Center flourished over the months, just as I had hoped. Became a beacon of hope, a space where young minds were nurtured and dreams were given the tools to thrive. I wasn't just providing resources, I was creating an environment where people felt seen, heard, and supported. The feeling of fulfillment that came from seeing someone discover their potential was indescribable. This was the legacy I wanted, one built on empowerment, compassion, and opportunity. As the center grew, it started receiving recognition in the local media. It wasn't long before it caught the attention of bigger organizations. I was invited to speak at conferences about entrepreneurship, community building, and overcoming adversity. I had become a symbol of resilience, not just in my community but in the wider world. The irony was that all this had happened without any of the approval I'd once so desperately sought from my family. Yet, despite all the accolades and successes, I never forgot where I came from. I kept working at the center, meeting with the kids, supporting the local programs, and mentoring the young entrepreneurs who were eager to make their mark. I knew that my journey wasn't about showing my family how far I'd come. It was about creating something that would live on beyond me, a place where people could rise above their circumstances and reach for their dreams, just as I had. Then one day, out of the blue, I received a letter from my cousin Rachel. It was a simple note, but its sincerity struck me. She wrote about how she had visited the community center with her children and how she had been deeply moved by what I had accomplished. For the first time in years, she expressed real pride in me, not because of the material success I had achieved, but because of the impact I was having on others. I'm sorry for the way I treated you in the past, she wrote. I was wrong to ever think that your worth was tied to your bank account or your status. You've done something incredible, and I'm proud to be your cousin. It wasn't just Rachel's words that resonated with me. It was the realization that this was the kind of change I had hoped for. I hadn't needed a grand gesture or a big apology. What mattered was that my family, the same ones who had once looked down on me, were now seeing me for who I truly was, not the poor relative but the person who had made a difference in the world. And that recognition, while unexpected, felt more meaningful than any reunion or validation ever could have. I replied to Rachel, telling her that I appreciated her message, but I wasn't holding on to any grudges. I had let go of the past long ago. What I had built, my life, my work, my legacy, was mine alone. I didn't need their acceptance anymore, but I was grateful that they were finally beginning to see the person I had become. It wasn't about revenge or proving anything. It was about living authentically, creating something real, and knowing that I was on the right path. As I looked back on everything, I realized that my family's rejection had been the catalyst for something far greater than I could have imagined. Without that initial pain, I might never have had the fire to succeed. I might never have had the determination to break free from the limitations they had imposed on me. In the end, their rejection had been the push I needed to create a life I was proud of, one that wasn't defined by their judgments. And as I continued to walk this path, I understood more clearly than ever. The legacy I had created wasn't just about success. It was about showing the world that no matter where you come from, you have the power to shape your future.